The wedding ceremony was a vision of opulence, set in the grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel in New York. Lavish floral arrangements draped from golden candelabras, a cascade of white roses intertwined with peonies and rare orchids. The air smelled of elegance and anticipation, underlined by the soft harmony of a string quartet. Guests clad in their finest, sipping champagne, buzzed with the delight of witnessing a high-society union. Thomas Gray, the dashing groom in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo, stood beneath a crystal chandelier, his hands clasped together. His eyes often drifted to Catherine Livingston, the picture of grace in her custom Vera Wang gown. Catherine's smile was perfect, rehearsed for this day since she was a little girl, but there was something about Thomas's demeanor, a lingering hint of distraction that made her hand grip her bouquet tighter. The anticipation swirled around them like a quiet storm. Just as the officiant began his welcoming speech, the grand doors of the ballroom burst open with a loud, echoing slam. All heads turned sharply toward the disturbance. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, stumbled into the hall. He was a mess, his brown hair unkempt, dirt streaked across his cheeks, and his eyes wide with a terror that stilled the entire room. Clutched to his chest was a crying infant wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "Help!" the boy yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. "Please, someone help us." The room fell into a stunned silence, like a spell had frozen everyone in place. The quartet halted mid-note, the dissonance lingering in the air. Catherine's face turned pale as whispers began to spread like wildfire among the guests. The boy's panicked cries shattered the formality of the moment, and a sense of confusion swept through the crowd. Thomas found himself moving before he knew why, breaking free from Catherine's side. There was something about the boy, a strange, almost magnetic pull that drove him forward. He knelt in front of the child, his polished demeanor crumbling as he tried to calm the visibly terrified boy. "Hey," Thomas said softly, though his heart thumped in his chest. "It's all right. I'm here. What's wrong? What happened?" The boy took a step back, clutching the baby tighter. We need to hide," he sobbed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're coming for us. Please, you have to help us." Thomas's confusion deepened, and he leaned closer, instinctively lowering his voice. "Who's coming?" he asked, but he could feel the eyes of the room pressing on him. On this situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control, Catherine approached, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and she placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, her grip firm. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice taut with embarrassment and disbelief. "This is our wedding. You can't just—" Thomas brushed her hand away, a surge of protectiveness toward the children taking over. The boy, whose eyes were the deepest shade of blue Thomas had ever seen, met his gaze with a mixture of fear and something Thomas couldn't quite place. A fleeting, inexplicable connection. The tension mounted, the elegant event hanging by a thread of civility. Guests watched, their curiosity piqued, yet Catherine's face burned with indignation. "Thomas," she hissed, trying to regain control. "This is madness. Our family is watching." But Thomas didn't hear her. The boy's fear was a palpable thing, and the baby's cries pierced his heart. "I have to do this," he murmured, and with that, the stage was set for a story that would unravel more secrets than anyone in that gilded ballroom could ever imagine. Thomas was still kneeling, his eyes level with the terrified boy who clutched the baby as if he were the only thing tethering him to this world. The ballroom behind them felt frozen, a tableau of disbelief and barely contained scandal. The boy trembled, and Thomas's own hands hovered unsurely, like he was afraid one wrong move would break the fragile moment. He leaned in, his voice gentle, almost paternal. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. The boy swallowed hard, his little chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "Sam," he whispered, his voice cracking from fear and exhaustion. Thomas glanced at the baby, whose cries were subsiding into shuddering whimpers. "And this little one?" "She's my sister," Sam said, tightening his grip. "Her name is Rosie." Thomas exchanged a brief, searching glance with Catherine. Her jaw was set, her cheeks flushed with a mix of confusion and anger. The guests, dressed in their finery, whispered behind manicured hands, their faces reflecting shock, intrigue, and judgment. A few, notably Thomas's parents, the Grays, stood stiffly in the background, their posture radiating displeasure. "Thomas," Catherine snapped, her voice pitched higher than she intended. "This is completely inappropriate. We need to." He raised a hand, silencing her, and for a moment, Catherine's fury turned cold. She had never seen Thomas so resolute, not like this, but there was no time to address her resentment. He turned his focus back to Sam, his expression serious but kind. "Sam, you said someone's coming after you," Thomas pressed, concern etching deeper lines into his forehead. "Who? Who's chasing you?" Sam bit his lip, looking over his shoulder as if expecting some unseen terror to burst through the doors. "Bad men," he whispered. "They took my mom. They said if I told anyone, they'd hurt Rosie and me." A collective shiver seemed to pass through the gathered crowd, and even Catherine flinched at the boy's words. The spell of disbelief that had settled over the ballroom cracked, replaced by a tension so thick it felt suffocating. Thomas's heart ached, but with a determination he couldn't explain, he found himself standing, his hands moving to rest on Sam's shoulders. "It's going to be okay," he promised, though a part of him already knew this was a promise he had no right to make. "You're safe now." "Safe?" Catherine interjected, her voice cutting through the emotion like a blade. "How can you say that? We don't even know who these children are." Thomas turned to her, his eyes blazing with a look that made her step back. "Look at him, Catherine," he said, his voice low but carrying a gravity she couldn't ignore. "They need help. Can't you see that?" Catherine's nostrils flared, and she crossed her arms. "Help them? You want to abandon our wedding for—" A voice called from the crowd. "Is everything all right here?" A man stepped forward, his posture stiff, his expression one of polite but urgent concern. It was Douglas Smith, a journalist from the New York Times, who had been covering the high-profile event. His eyes narrowed, sensing a potential story in the unfolding chaos. Thomas shot him a glare that left no room for misunderstanding. "This is a private matter," he said, a warning clear in his tone. But Douglas wasn't deterred. "I only want to understand what's going on. A child bursting into a wedding like this. People are going to talk, Mr. Gray." Thomas clenched his jaw, knowing all too well the consequences of this scene. His family's name was synonymous with power, reputation, and secrets. An incident like this could be damaging, but he no longer cared about appearances, not when he saw the terror written all over Sam's face. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, mostly to himself, before lifting his gaze to the stunned room. "Catherine," he said, his voice steady, "I can't stay here. I have to help them." Catherine's eyes widened, disbelief transforming into rage. "You have to be joking," she hissed. "You would throw away our day, my day, for this?" Thomas's heart twisted painfully. "It's not just about today," he replied. "These children are in danger. I can't stand by and do nothing." Catherine's eyes glistened with tears, but it wasn't sorrow. It was anger, a betrayal she hadn't anticipated. "You've always had a habit of making dramatic gestures, but this is unforgivable." "I'll make it right," Thomas whispered, and even he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, her or himself. With that, he turned back to Sam and Rosie. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than his years, and Thomas made a decision that would unravel more of his life than he was ready to comprehend. He gently took Sam's free hand, and together, with Rosie cradled against Sam's small chest, they walked out of the luxurious ballroom. The stunned silence followed them, leaving Catherine standing in her immaculate wedding gown, now only a ghost in the ceremony that had crumbled before her eyes. The last thing Thomas heard as the heavy doors swung closed behind them was Catherine's choked sob, echoing through the grand hall like a eulogy for everything they had planned. The door to the grand ballroom closed with a resounding thud, leaving behind the shocked murmurs and judgmental stares of New York's elite. Thomas stepped into the hotel's marble hallway, the noise from the ceremony fading into the distance. The atmosphere outside felt different, quieter, more uncertain. He tightened his grip on Sam's hand, aware of the trembling in the boy's small fingers. Sam looked up at him, blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, and held Rosie a little closer to his chest. The baby had settled, her tired whimpers subsiding, but her tiny face still showed the red stains of tears. Thomas felt his heart wrench as he took in their appearance. The dirt smudged on their skin, the threadbare clothes that seemed so out of place in the glamorous hotel setting. How could such small, innocent children be caught in something so terrifying? Thomas knelt down to Sam's level, trying to project calm despite the storm raging in his own chest. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said softly. "I promise." Sam's lip quivered. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "They always find us." Thomas's gut twisted at the hopelessness in the boy's words. "Who's they?" he asked. "Can you tell me more?" Sam's eyes darted to the shadows of the hallway. "Men in black cars," he said, his voice small and shaky. "They took Mom. I tried to hide Rosie, but they know everything." Thomas's mind raced. Men in black cars. Abductions. His instincts screamed that this situation was far more dangerous than he had imagined, but he forced himself to stay calm for Sam's sake. He had no idea who these men were, but he could feel the weight of an unseen threat closing in. It was then that he realized the gravity of what he had done. Walking out of his wedding, defying his family, and taking these children under his wing without fully understanding the danger. "Okay," Thomas said, straightening up. "First, we need to get out of here. Do you trust me?" Sam hesitated, his eyes scanning Thomas's face as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded, his grip on Rosie tightening. Thomas led them toward the hotel side entrance. As they moved, he glanced over his shoulder and noticed a couple of guests drifting into the hallway. Their curiosity piqued. He had to move quickly. The last thing he needed was to draw more attention. Just as they neared the exit, the loud, frantic voice of his mother, Victoria Gray, cut through the air. "Thomas, what on earth are you doing?" He froze. Victoria, her perfectly styled hair and pearl earrings glinting under the hotel's chandeliers, strode toward him. She was flanked by Thomas's father, Richard Gray, who had the same cold, disapproving glare he always wore when something didn't go according to plan. Their family had never been one for scandal, and the abrupt end to his wedding had probably set off alarms louder than the hotel's fire system. Victoria's eyes landed on the children, and her face twisted in disbelief. "Who are these street urchins?" she demanded, her voice low and harsh. "What is the meaning of this? We have guests waiting, Thomas. This isn't the time for whatever insanity this is." Thomas felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had always been the obedient son, the one who kept up appearances, made the right connections, and did what was expected of him. But in this moment, that part of him felt distant, irrelevant. "Mother," he said, keeping his voice steady, "these children are in danger. I need to get them to safety." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Danger? What on earth are you talking about? We have a reputation to uphold. You're ruining Catherine's day, our day." "Catherine will be fine," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't about her or our family. These children need help. Now." Richard stepped forward, his presence like a shadow that had loomed over Thomas his entire life. "Son," he said in that deep, commanding voice, "you are making a spectacle. We can deal with this situation later. Right now, come back inside and stop this nonsense." For a moment, Thomas's resolve wavered. He felt the crushing pressure of his family's expectations, the weight of the life he was leaving behind. But then he looked at Sam, at the way the boy clung to Rosie, shielding her from the cold and from any further harm. There was no choice. "I can't," Thomas said, almost whispering. "I won't." Victoria's face flushed with fury. "You ungrateful." But before she could finish, Thomas pulled Sam and Rosie behind him, stepping closer to his parents. "If you want to help, get someone to watch the exits," he said. "I think we're being followed." Richard's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Followed by who?" "You've lost your mind, Thomas." Thomas shook his head, his eyes meeting his father's with a finality he hadn't felt before. "I'll explain later," he said, knowing full well that he might never have the chance. "But right now, I need you to trust me. Just this once." Victoria and Richard shared a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Thomas didn't wait to see what they would do. He turned back to Sam and led him down the hallway, pushing open the heavy doors that led out into a side alley. The city air hit them like a blast of cold reality, the distant rumble of traffic echoing off the walls. Thomas pulled out his phone, his mind racing for options. He had an old house, one he hadn't set foot in for years, a place few people even knew about. It wasn't luxurious, but it would have to do. "We're going somewhere safe," he told Sam again, and though his voice was confident, his hands trembled as he dialed for a car. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, he had a feeling that whatever nightmare Sam and Rosie were running from was only just beginning. The city outside was loud and relentless, the hum of car engines, honking horns, and distant shouts forming a chaotic backdrop to their escape. Thomas stood in the narrow alley, his pulse racing as he glanced back at the hotel's side entrance. His parents hadn't followed him outside yet, but he knew that wouldn't last long. The weight of his decision still pressed on him, but there was no time to second-guess. He had to keep moving. Sam stood close, his small hand tightly clutching Thomas's, while Rosie nestled in her brother's arms, her cries fading into exhausted silence. The baby's head drooped, her breathing uneven, and Thomas wondered if she'd eaten anything substantial in days. Sam's face was pale, eyes darting to every sound as if expecting monsters to leap out of the shadows. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Thomas hurried the children into the back seat. The driver, an older man named Victor whom Thomas had relied on for years, turned in his seat, his eyebrows lifting in surprise at the sight of Thomas and the two scruffy children climbing into his car. "Mr. Gray?" Victor asked, his voice a mix of confusion and concern. "Is everything all right?" Thomas closed the door behind him and glanced out the window, half expecting to see a fleet of black cars coming for them. "No," he replied, forcing his voice to remain calm. "But I need you to drive. And quickly." Victor didn't ask any more questions. He had been employed by the Gray family long enough to know when not to pry. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the relentless New York traffic. Thomas kept glancing back, his anxiety coiling tighter with each passing second. Every car that followed too closely made his heart lurch. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Beside him, Sam's grip on Rosie had gone slack, as if he were running out of strength to keep up the pretense of being brave. Thomas watched the boy for a moment, his heart aching at the sight of someone so young carrying so much weight. "You did good, Sam," Thomas said, his voice soft. "You kept her safe. But now I need you to rest. Let me take care of things." Sam's eyes flicked up to Thomas, wary but hopeful, as if he wanted so desperately to believe in that promise. He didn't respond, but he adjusted Rosie in his arms, and Thomas realized the boy was trying to keep himself from crying. Thomas had no idea what these kids had been through, but he could see that Sam had been forced to grow up too quickly, burdened with responsibilities no child should bear. They weaved through traffic, and as the city skyline blurred past them, Thomas began formulating a plan. "Victor," he said, leaning forward, "take us to Willow Street." The old brownstone. Victor's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. "Sir," he said cautiously, "that house hasn't been touched in years. Are you sure?" Thomas nodded, clenching his jaw. "I'm sure. It's the safest place I can think of." The old brownstone was Thomas's childhood home, left behind and nearly forgotten after his family had moved on to more prestigious addresses. No one would expect him to return there, not even his parents. The thought of going back stirred old memories, most of them tinged with grief and unresolved feelings. But this wasn't the time to dwell on the past. Right now, it was a refuge. The car fell silent except for the occasional hiccup from Rosie and the low hum of the engine. Thomas sat back, running a hand through his hair as he tried to think of his next steps. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting to see Catherine's name, or perhaps an onslaught of angry messages from his parents. But instead, the screen showed an unknown number. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, followed by a voice that sent a chill down his spine. You have something that doesn't belong to you, the man on the other end drawled, his voice smooth yet menacing. Hand over the children, Thomas, and maybe this won't have to get ugly. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Who is this? He demanded, gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. The man chuckled, a sound that oozed danger. You think your family's wealth and influence make you untouchable? Think again. We're watching, and if you don't cooperate, you'll find out just how touchable you really are. Thomas's heart pounded. Stay away from them, he said, his voice low and deadly. I swear, if you come near these kids. The line went dead. Thomas dropped the phone into his lap, his hands shaking. Sam, who had been staring out the window, turned his head slightly. Who was that? The boy whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the rumble of the car. Thomas struggled to find the right words. Just someone we need to stay away from, he said, trying to sound reassuring. But his mind was racing. How had they already found out he was involved? How much danger were they truly in? The car turned onto Willow Street, a quiet, tree-lined block that felt worlds away from the chaos of Manhattan. The old brownstone stood at the end, its red brick facade partially hidden by overgrown ivy. The front windows were dusty, the paint on the front door chipped and weathered. It looked forgotten, abandoned. But to Thomas, it was a fortress. They stepped out of the car, the children clinging to him as he ushered them up the steps. He fumbled with the old key, a piece of cold brass he hadn't touched in over a decade, and finally managed to get the door open. The inside smelled of dust and nostalgia, the rooms dark and filled with the echoes of a past Thomas had long tried to bury. He led them into the living room, where old furniture sat draped in white sheets. Setting Rosie down on a faded couch, Thomas turned to Sam. You'll be safe here, he said, his voice firm. No one knows about this place. Sam nodded, though his eyes were full of questions, of doubts. Thomas knelt in front of him, feeling the enormity of what he had taken on. I'm going to protect you, he whispered, looking at the boy. But I need you to trust me. Sam bit his lip, then finally whispered, I'm scared. Thomas's throat tightened, but he reached out and placed a gentle hand on Sam's shoulder. Me too, he admitted. But I won't let anything happen to you or Rosie. I swear. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the ivy against the windows, and Thomas couldn't help but feel that something dark was already closing in. The old brownstone creaked and groaned with the wind, each sound amplifying the tension that had settled heavily inside the dusty walls. Thomas stood in the center of the living room, his body tense as he took in their surroundings. The house had once been full of warmth, laughter, and family memories, but now it felt haunted by its past. Sheets covered every piece of furniture, and motes of dust hung in the cold air, catching the faint light that filtered through the grimy windows. Sam sat on the edge of an old, sheet-draped armchair, his hands still clutching Rosie, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. Her tiny fist was curled against her cheek, and even in sleep, her brow was furrowed, as if the terror of the past days hadn't released its hold on her. Sam's shoulders were hunched, his face pale and weary, yet he sat upright, as if bracing himself for whatever came next. Thomas moved around the room, pulling down the sheets that covered the furniture and folding them neatly, if only to give himself something to do. The familiar smells of the house brought a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Loss, maybe, or the longing for a simpler time. But he had no room for sentiment now. He had 2 children to protect, and a man with a dangerous voice had just threatened him. He grabbed his phone, his hands still trembling from the call, and made his way to the kitchen. The space was dark, with old wooden cabinets and a marble counter that had once been polished to a high sheen. He flipped on a light, and the bulb flickered before casting a dim, yellowish glow over the room. Thomas pressed a number on his phone and waited, his pulse echoing in his ears. Pick up, he muttered. Come on, pick up. Finally, a familiar voice answered. Thomas. It was Luke, an old friend and private investigator, a man Thomas trusted with the secrets he couldn't afford to share with his family. Luke, Thomas said, struggling to keep his voice calm, I need your help, and fast. Luke's tone shifted immediately from friendly to professional. What's going on? Thomas glanced back at the living room, where Sam sat silently, still as a statue. "It's complicated," Thomas began, lowering his voice. "I've got 2 kids here. They're running from something, someone dangerous. And I just got a call, a threat. They know I'm involved now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the sound of Luke scribbling something down. "Where are you?" "Willow Street," Thomas replied. "My old house. I need to keep them safe until I figure out who's behind this." Luke's voice was steady and reassuring. "All right, I'm on my way. I'll bring some equipment, do a perimeter check when I get there. Lock everything down in the meantime." And Thomas, "Yeah, be careful," Luke warned. "If these people are as serious as you say, they won't hesitate to make a move." Thomas hung up, his stomach twisting. He knew Luke was right. Whoever these people were, they had resources. He couldn't afford to underestimate them. Returning to the living room, Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down across from Sam. The boy was staring at the floor, his hair falling in messy strands over his eyes. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "Sam," he said, trying to keep his voice as soothing as possible, "can you tell me more about what happened to your mom?" Sam looked up, and his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Mom tried to keep us hidden," he said, his voice shaking. "But the men came anyway. They broke into our house at night, and I heard her scream. She told me to take Rosie and run, so I did. I hid until they were gone." He wiped at his eyes with a small, dirty hand. "They took her, and I don't know where she is." Thomas felt a wave of helplessness crash over him. How could someone so small have endured so much? He swallowed, trying to hide the tremble in his voice. "We'll find her," he promised, even though he had no idea how he would keep that promise. "I won't let them hurt you or your sister." Sam sniffled and nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. He was just a child, Thomas realized, and yet he was trying so hard to be brave, to carry a burden far too heavy for his small frame. The front door creaked suddenly, and Thomas was on his feet in an instant. He moved toward the door, his heart pounding, but it was only Victor, the driver, who stepped inside, carrying a plastic bag full of food. The older man looked around, his face etched with worry. "I thought you might need something to eat," he said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "I'll stay outside, keep an eye out. If anyone comes near, I'll honk twice." Thomas exhaled, grateful for the man's loyalty. "Thank you, Victor," he said. "I don't know how long we'll be here, but I owe you." Victor nodded, his eyes understanding. "Take care of them," he said quietly, before stepping back outside, closing the door softly behind him. Thomas unpacked the food and brought it into the living room. "Sam," he said, his voice gentle, "you should eat something. Both of you need your strength." Sam hesitated, then slowly set Rosie down on the couch, making sure she was still wrapped securely in her blanket. He took a sandwich from Thomas, his hands shaking with hunger and exhaustion, and bit into it. Watching him, Thomas felt his chest ache with a fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. He had walked away from his wedding, shattered his family's expectations, and plunged into a world of danger, all for 2 children he had only just met. Yet somehow, it felt like the most important thing he had ever done. The house creaked again, and the wind howled through the old windows. Thomas stood by the window, peering out at the street below. It was quiet, too quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his line of sight. He clenched his fists, determined to be ready for whatever came next. But in the back of his mind, a haunting question lingered. How long could he keep them safe before the storm finally broke? Thomas stood by the window, the shadows outside thickening as dusk began to drape itself over the street. The dim light of early evening played tricks on his eyes, casting sinister shapes against the old houses lining Willow Street. Every passing car seemed to slow down a fraction too long, and each creak of the wind felt like a warning. He forced himself to focus, to scan the street with the eyes of someone who had everything to lose. Behind him, the children were quiet. Sam had finished his sandwich, and though Rosie remained fast asleep, she seemed more settled, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Sam hovered near her, his tiny body a shield, even in rest. It broke Thomas's heart to see how protective the boy was, how his whole world had become about survival. No toys, no laughter, no carefree childhood. Thomas rubbed his temples, exhaustion setting in, but he couldn't afford to rest. He stepped away from the window and walked back to the living room, forcing a smile that felt as fragile as glass. "We need to make sure we're safe tonight," he said, crouching down to meet Sam's eyes. "So we're going to stay upstairs where it's quieter, okay?" Sam nodded, his face expressionless but his eyes betraying the fear that never left him. Thomas lifted Rosie carefully, cradling the small weight of her body, and gestured for Sam to follow. They climbed the old staircase, each step creaking underfoot, as if the house was waking from a long sleep. Memories flooded Thomas, rushing up these same stairs as a boy, laughing with his sister, his mother calling him for dinner. But now the house felt colder, haunted by more than just old ghosts. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, and Thomas led them to a room at the end, one that had belonged to him. He pushed open the door, and the musty smell of disuse met them. Faded posters of rock bands still clung to the walls, and a small bed with blue-striped sheets stood in the corner. Thomas moved to the window, pulling down the old blackout curtain to cover the view. It made the room feel smaller, but safer. He set Rosie down on the bed and gently covered her with an old quilt, hoping the familiar comfort of soft fabric would keep her asleep. Sam hovered near the door, not quite stepping all the way into the room. Thomas's heart ached to see how the boy stood, ready to flee at any sign of danger. "You can come in," Thomas said, trying to keep his tone light, as if they were playing some kind of game instead of hiding from a nameless threat. Sam took a tentative step inside, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and finally came to stand beside Rosie. Thomas pulled a wooden chair close to the bed and sat down, keeping himself between the door and the children. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been, but adrenaline kept him alert. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fished it out, seeing a message from Luke. "Almost there. Hang tight." Thomas exhaled, some of the tension in his chest loosening. Help was on the way. But even as he reassured himself, he knew deep down that whatever was happening wasn't going to end cleanly. Whoever had taken Sam and Rosie's mother, whoever had issued that phone threat, was part of something much larger than he had the capacity to handle on his own. He looked back at Sam, who had finally settled onto the bed beside Rosie. The boy was stroking his sister's hair, whispering things only a sibling could understand. The tenderness in Sam's eyes was heartbreaking, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder what their mother had gone through to protect them, how far she had gone to keep her children safe before she was taken. A thought struck Thomas then, one he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. What if he couldn't save their mother? What if he failed to protect Sam and Rosie too? The sound of gravel crunching outside shattered his dark thoughts. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, his heart thundering. He crept to the window, lifting the edge of the blackout curtain just enough to peek out. A black SUV had pulled up across the street, its headlights off, the vehicle sitting like a silent predator in the gathering darkness. Thomas's pulse skyrocketed. He couldn't see who was inside, but the ominous presence of the car sent every nerve in his body into overdrive. He quickly crossed the room and locked the door, his movements deliberate but quiet. Sam, noticing Thomas's sudden change in demeanor, clutched Rosie a little tighter, his wide eyes darting between Thomas and the door. "Stay here," Thomas whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "And don't make a sound." Sam nodded, though his lower lip trembled. Thomas grabbed a heavy lamp from the nightstand, the closest thing to a weapon he could find, and pressed his ear to the door, listening. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. He could hear the faintest rustling from downstairs, the groan of floorboards that should have been silent in an empty house. The realization hit him hard. Someone was inside. He backed away from the door, his grip tightening on the lamp. His phone vibrated again in his pocket, startling him, but he didn't dare answer. Instead, he pulled it out and saw a message from Luke. "Here, out front. Where are you?" Thomas quickly texted back, "Upstairs. Intruder in the house." The seconds felt like hours as he waited for a reply. Downstairs, the quiet noises continued. The scrape of a shoe, the whisper of movement. Then came the sound of something falling over, followed by a low curse. Whoever was in the house wasn't as stealthy as they thought. Another text from Luke, on it. Stay put. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He prayed Luke knew what he was doing, because there was no room for error. He glanced back at Sam, who had crawled up beside Rosie, shielding her tiny body with his own. The sight filled Thomas with a fierce, protective anger. Whoever was in this house had already taken so much from these children, and he'd be damned if he let them take anything more. Footsteps grew louder, approaching the stairs. Thomas raised the lamp, his muscles coiled, ready to do whatever it took to protect the two young souls who had unexpectedly become the most important thing in his life. Thomas stood by the bedroom door, his grip tightening on the makeshift weapon, every muscle tensed, listening as the intruder's footsteps creaked up the stairs. Each step felt like the ticking of a bomb, counting down the seconds until he'd have to face whoever had invaded the house. In the dim room, the only sounds were the shallow breaths of Sam and Rosie, huddled together on the bed, watching him with wide, fearful eyes. He motioned to Sam, silently signaling for him to stay low, and the boy nodded, covering Rosie's face protectively as if he could shield her from the nightmare unraveling around them. Thomas's mind raced, recalling every corner of the house, every possible escape route. But the only way out now was through whoever was coming up those stairs. Luke was outside somewhere, but he knew Luke wouldn't risk moving until he had a clear plan, and Thomas couldn't count on help in the next few moments. It was down to him to protect Sam and Rosie, and there was no room for error. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, and Thomas held his breath, hoping the intruder would assume the house was empty and leave. But the silence was broken by the faint beep of a device, a low, almost mechanical sound that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Whoever was in the house wasn't just here by accident. They were searching for something, for someone. Thomas took a deep, steadying breath, centering himself. He was in his element in corporate boardrooms, negotiating deals, managing crises. But this was a different world, a raw, instinctual place that required him to protect with more than words. He took a step back, positioning himself in front of the bed where the children were hiding. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline sharpening his senses, heightening every detail. The scuff of shoes against old hardwood, the creak of floorboards as the intruder moved closer. The faintest outline of a shadow appeared beneath the doorframe. The intruder was just on the other side. Thomas's grip on the lamp tightened as he braced himself. In a swift, fluid motion, the door handle turned, and the door swung open slowly, revealing a tall, lean man silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. The man's face was obscured, but Thomas caught a glint of something metallic in his hand, a gun. Instinct took over. He knew he couldn't wait to see what the man planned to do next. With a surge of determination, Thomas lunged forward, swinging the lamp with every ounce of strength he could muster. The metal base connected with a sickening crack, and the man staggered back, caught off guard by the force of the blow. His gun clattered to the ground, and Thomas seized the opportunity, rushing forward to grab the weapon. But the man recovered quickly, lurching forward and grabbing Thomas by the collar, shoving him back with surprising strength. They grappled, their movements desperate, silent save for the grunts of exertion. The man was trained, precise, his every move calculated to take Thomas down swiftly. But Thomas's desperation fueled him, giving him a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He managed to twist out of the man's grip, throwing another wild punch, this time connecting with the man's jaw. The intruder stumbled, and Thomas dove for the gun on the floor, his hand closing around the cold metal just as the man lunged at him again. Thomas raised the gun, pointing it directly at the intruder, his finger hovering over the trigger, his breath ragged. "Don't move," Thomas ordered, his voice low and deadly. Not another step. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Thomas with cold calculation. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint whimper of Rosie from the bed, her small voice barely audible. For a brief second, the man's gaze flickered to the children, and something cruel glinted in his eyes. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Thomas tightened his grip on the gun, his expression hardening. "I don't care who you are. If you take one step toward those kids, I swear." The man's gaze didn't waver, and he let out a mocking laugh, his tone dripping with contempt. "You think you can protect them? You've only just made things worse for them. For all of you." Before Thomas could react, the man's hand darted to his pocket, pulling out a sleek, black device, some kind of signal jammer. He pressed a button, and instantly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through Thomas as he blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the sudden lack of light. The shadows swallowed everything, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where the man was. He stepped back, keeping his body between the bed and the last place he'd seen the intruder. "Sam," he whispered urgently, "hold on to Rosie. Don't let go." A faint sniffle was his only answer, but he felt Sam's trust, the boy's silent resolve to protect his sister no matter what. Thomas swallowed, focusing his senses on the slightest sound, any hint of movement. He couldn't see, but he could hear. The quiet shuffling of feet, a breath, the faintest scrape of cloth against the wall. Suddenly, the intruder moved, charging forward in the darkness, and Thomas fired. The gunshot echoed through the room, lighting up the shadows for a split second. The intruder dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder, but he wasn't down yet. He lunged again, his injured arm swinging wildly, and Thomas barely managed to dodge the blow. They struggled, a desperate, blind fight in the dark. Thomas's only thought was of Sam and Rosie, of keeping them safe, of making sure this man never got close to them. Finally, with a surge of strength, Thomas pushed the man back, and he crashed into the dresser, his body slumping to the ground. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and Thomas tensed, raising the gun, ready for another fight. But a familiar voice called out, urgent and steady. "Thomas, it's me, Luke." Relief flooded through him as Luke appeared in the doorway, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He took in the scene, his sharp eyes moving from the intruder on the floor to Thomas, who was still shaking, the gun in his hand. "Let's get them out of here," Luke said, his voice calm but urgent. He moved to check the intruder, ensuring he was down, then turned back to Thomas, nodding toward the children. Thomas felt his legs almost give way as the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. But he couldn't stop now. He moved to the bed, where Sam sat, clutching Rosie protectively. Thomas reached out, his voice soft but resolute. "It's all right," he said, guiding Sam and Rosie into his arms. "We're getting out of here." The children clung to him as they moved through the house, Luke covering their exit. Thomas didn't know where they'd go next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would do whatever it took to protect them. The night air outside the brownstone was cold and biting, swirling around them as Thomas hurriedly guided Sam and Rosie down the steps, with Luke close behind. The children clung to him, their small bodies tense, and Thomas could feel their terror radiating through their thin frames. Rosie, still half asleep, let out a small whimper as the sudden chill woke her, her eyes wide and confused as she looked up at him. "It's all right, Rosie," he whispered softly, wrapping an arm around her. "We're going somewhere safe." Luke kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, his gaze sharp as he scanned the street. The black SUV across the way was gone, but they both knew better than to assume they were in the clear. Whoever was after Sam and Rosie was methodical, relentless, and wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Thomas's mind raced, grappling with the enormity of what they were up against. "Where do we go now?" Sam's voice broke the silence, a mix of exhaustion and fear. The bravery he had shown earlier was fading, replaced by the vulnerability of a child who had seen too much, who was desperate for answers. Thomas looked at him, his heart twisting at the boy's haunted expression. "We're going to find somewhere safer than this," he promised, though he knew he was stalling, buying time as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't go to the police. The threat was too powerful, too connected. He was certain that anyone with that much reach would know how to manipulate the authorities, how to track them through any official system. Luke, seeming to read Thomas's mind, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know a place," he said quietly, glancing down at the children. It's out of the city, more isolated. Only a few trusted people know about it. We'll have more time there to regroup, to figure out our next steps." Thomas met Luke's gaze, relief mixing with gratitude. He knew Luke wouldn't offer anything he wasn't absolutely sure about. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. He was exhausted, the weight of the night bearing down on him, but he couldn't afford to break down now. Not when Sam and Rosie needed him. They moved quickly to Luke's car, a nondescript sedan that blended in easily with the dark streets of New York. Luke took the driver's seat, and Thomas slid into the back with the children, pulling them close as they settled in. He watched through the rear window as the city lights began to blur, fading into the distance as they left Manhattan, heading north. The car was silent for a long stretch of road, the quiet punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. Thomas felt his mind drift, questions swirling in his thoughts. Who were these men? What did they want with Sam and Rosie's mother? And why had they taken her while leaving the children to run? He glanced down at Sam, whose eyes were half closed, his head drooping with exhaustion. Thomas hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Sam," he said softly, "I need you to tell me everything you know. Anything your mom told you about these men, or what they wanted. Even if it doesn't seem important." Sam took a shaky breath, gathering his thoughts, his small hands balled into fists on his lap. "Mom didn't say much," he began, his voice a whisper, "but she was scared all the time. She kept telling me to remember things, like our old address and her friends' names. She said that if anything happened to her, I had to take care of Rosie. I had to keep her safe." Thomas's heart clenched as he imagined what it must have been like for Sam, living under constant fear, bearing responsibilities far beyond his years. Did she ever say who these men were, or what they wanted? Sam shook his head, looking down, the memory visibly painful. "No, but she had this box, a metal one. She told me never to touch it. She said it was something dangerous, something that she kept hidden from them. She didn't say more, but I saw her hide it once, under the floor in her bedroom closet." Luke, who had been listening from the front seat, glanced at Thomas through the rearview mirror. "A hidden box," he muttered. "That could be why they took her and why they're after the kids. It must hold something they need, something important enough to risk everything for." Thomas nodded, his mind racing as he pieced together this new information. If Sam's mother had hidden something vital, something dangerous enough that she couldn't speak about it even to her own son, it meant they were dealing with forces that extended far beyond a simple criminal threat. "Then that box might be the answer," he murmured, almost to himself. "If we can find it, maybe we can find a way to end this." Luke gave him a sharp look. "Going back to her house is risky. They've likely already torn it apart looking for anything they can find. But," he paused, considering, "if it's hidden well enough, maybe it's still there. We could plan a search. I know a few people who might help." Thomas nodded, though the idea of involving more people made him uneasy. The fewer who knew, the safer it would be for Sam and Rosie. But if they were to find the truth, they would need all the help they could get. They drove for another hour, the city long behind them as they ventured into the quiet, winding roads of the countryside. Trees lined either side of the narrow road, and the darkness seemed to press in, broken only by the faint glow of the car's headlights. Finally, Luke pulled off onto a secluded gravel road, driving deeper into the woods until they arrived at a small cabin, half hidden among the trees. It was simple, isolated, and exactly what they needed. Thomas carried Rosie inside, her small body limp in his arms, while Sam trailed close behind, looking around with wary eyes. The cabin was basic but comfortable, with a couple of rooms, a kitchenette, and a wood stove in the corner that filled the space with a faint smell of pine. Thomas laid Rosie down on one of the beds, covering her with a blanket as she murmured in her sleep, her face softening in the warmth of the room. Sam stood beside the bed, watching her closely. He had barely left her side since they'd arrived, his protective instincts keeping him tethered to his sister. Thomas placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You can rest now," he said, his voice calm. "She's safe here. You both are." Sam nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on Rosie, as if he couldn't quite let go of his fear. Thomas didn't press him, understanding that it would take more than words to reassure a boy who had seen so much. He watched as Sam eventually climbed onto the bed beside his sister, curling up beside her as his eyes drifted shut, the tension in his small body finally easing. Luke sat down at the small table by the window, pulling out a map and a notebook. Thomas joined him, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think this will be enough? Just hiding out here?" Luke shook his head, his gaze hard. "They'll look everywhere, Thomas. Once they know you're involved, it won't take long for them to find us here. This is temporary, just enough to buy us time." Thomas swallowed, feeling the weight of his choices settle on him. But as he glanced back at Sam and Rosie, their small bodies huddled together in sleep, he knew he'd go to any lengths to protect them, to shield them from the shadow that had chased them for so long. "Then we don't waste a second," he said quietly. "We need to find that box. And we need to do it before they find us." The cabin was silent, the only sounds the soft crackling of the wood stove and the rhythmic breathing of Sam and Rosie as they slept. Thomas sat by the window with Luke, peering out into the dense woods, watching the shadows shift under the faint light of the moon. He felt the weight of exhaustion, but sleep was out of the question. His mind raced with questions, none of which had easy answers. "All right," Luke said, breaking the silence as he unfurled a map of the city across the small table. "We need a plan to get into Sam and Rosie's old place without drawing attention. If they're still watching the area, we'll have to be fast. Maybe go in through the back or somewhere they wouldn't expect." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes scanning the streets on the map. The neighborhood where Sam and Rosie had lived was densely populated, surrounded by parks and a few alleyways that led into quieter side streets. If they could avoid the front entrance, there was a chance they could slip in unnoticed. Luke continued, tapping a spot on the map. "Here's the main road that leads to their place. If we park about a block away, we can cut through this alley and use the neighboring buildings as cover." Thomas nodded, already mentally preparing for the risks. "It'll have to be quick," he said, glancing at the door to the room where Sam and Rosie lay asleep. "We can't leave them here for long, not with everything going on." Luke's face softened, and he gave a slight nod. "They'll be safe here," he assured him, his voice steady. "I've got backup on standby. We'll post someone just outside the cabin. If anything happens, they'll call us immediately." Relieved but not entirely reassured, Thomas finally leaned back, trying to steady his thoughts. "I just keep wondering why her. Why their mother," he murmured. She was terrified, keeping them hidden, and yet she held on to something dangerous enough that it got her taken. "It doesn't add up." Luke frowned, running a hand through his hair. "She might have been involved with something bigger than we realize. Maybe she stumbled onto something or someone. Something powerful enough to keep her running." He paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. That box might hold a connection to whoever's after them. Evidence, information, maybe even blackmail material. It has to be something they're willing to go to extreme lengths for. The enormity of it hung in the air between them. Whatever was in that box was a danger not only to Sam and Rosie, but to anyone who tried to protect them. Still, Thomas knew there was no other way. If they didn't take action, they'd be running forever, and that wasn't a life he could accept for those kids. They packed the essentials, a flashlight, gloves, tools in case they had to force any doors or locks, and Thomas glanced one last time at the room where the children slept, their small figures bundled together under the quilt. He took a steadying breath, hoping the fear in his chest wasn't visible on his face. He and Luke moved silently out the door and into the night, the forest wrapping around them like a shroud. Luke's car was parked under a canopy of trees, its dark color blending seamlessly with the shadows. They climbed in, and soon they were on the road, the engine humming quietly as they wound through the back roads that led back toward the city. The weight of the cabin's isolation slipped away as they neared the urban sprawl, replaced by the sense of entering enemy territory. The streets were quiet as they parked a block away from Sam and Rosie's building. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the surge of adrenaline as they stepped out into the cool night air. Luke led the way, keeping to the edges of the street, avoiding streetlights, their footsteps barely audible on the pavement. The building loomed ahead, its darkened windows hinting at the silence within. They moved to the back, where a small, narrow gate led into a courtyard obscured by overgrown bushes. Luke checked the area, his eyes sharp, assessing every shadow. "Looks clear," he whispered. "Let's make this quick." They slipped through the gate and entered the courtyard, sticking close to the wall. The building's back door was old and slightly ajar, as if the lock had been forced before. Thomas's gut tightened. Someone had been here recently, maybe even the same men who had taken Sam and Rosie's mother. He exchanged a tense glance with Luke, who nodded in understanding. "Stay sharp," Luke murmured as they entered the building. Inside, the air was thick and stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and dust. They climbed the stairs quietly, reaching the third floor where Sam and Rosie's apartment was located. The hallway stretched before them, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that cast eerie shadows on the walls. They approached the door, and Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. Luke stepped forward, pressing his ear to the door. He held up a hand, signaling for Thomas to wait, and listened intently. After a long, silent moment, he nodded. "No one's inside," he whispered. Thomas exhaled, feeling a surge of relief. Luke tried the door, but it was locked tight, so he pulled out a small toolkit, working the lock open with practiced efficiency. It clicked, and he pushed the door open slowly, revealing the dark interior of the apartment. The layout was simple, a small living area leading into a narrow hallway that branched into bedrooms and a bathroom. Thomas entered, his footsteps muffled against the worn carpet. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on scattered toys, a few children's books on a shelf, and a faint scent of lavender that hung in the air. It was a place that had once been a home, but now felt haunted, as if the life had been drained from it. "Where did Sam say it was?" Luke whispered, already moving toward the bedrooms. "In the closet, under a loose floorboard," Thomas replied, following him down the hall to the master bedroom. They stepped inside, the moonlight casting a ghostly glow over the space. The room was sparsely decorated, with only a bed, a dresser, and a closet tucked into the far wall. Luke knelt, sweeping a flashlight over the floor as he ran his hand along the edges of the closet. After a few seconds, his fingers found a small gap in the wood, and he lifted the floorboard carefully. Beneath it lay a small metal box, its surface scratched and scuffed but intact. Thomas held his breath as Luke pulled it out, both of them studying it in silence. The box was locked with a simple latch, but it looked solid, like it had been secured to withstand years of hiding. "Do we open it here?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Luke shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Too risky. We don't know what's in it, or if it's rigged. Let's get out of here first." They slipped the box into a bag, securing it tightly, and exited the apartment as quietly as they'd entered. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Thomas's instincts flared. A low, muffled sound came from outside, followed by the distinct crunch of footsteps approaching the back entrance. Luke froze, holding up a hand, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "They're here," he mouthed, his jaw tense. Thomas's mind raced. There was no time to run back up the stairs or hide in the apartment. They had to move, and fast. He motioned to a small door under the stairs, a maintenance closet barely large enough for one person. They slipped inside, squeezing into the cramped space, their breaths barely controlled as they tried to remain silent. Through the thin door, Thomas heard the sound of men entering the building, their voices low and menacing. One of them laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the stairwell. They tore the place apart, a voice muttered. "She really hit it well, didn't she?" Another voice, darker and colder, replied, "If it's not here, we'll keep searching. Someone knows where that box is, and they're going to tell us one way or another." Thomas's fists clenched, his pulse pounding as the footsteps moved up the stairs, disappearing into the apartment above. He felt a surge of determination. Whatever was in that box was worth risking everything to these men, and he would do everything in his power to make sure they never got it. The footsteps above them faded, and Thomas held his breath, listening as the men moved around the apartment. Their voices echoed, low and sharp, with an urgency that sent a chill down his spine. He and Luke remained perfectly still, crammed together in the tiny maintenance closet, barely enough space to move. The metal box pressed against Thomas's side, a constant reminder of the stakes they were facing. Whatever secrets it held had driven these men to tear through homes, abduct innocent people, and put 2 children's lives in danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices drifted back down the stairs. Thomas could hear one of the men grumbling, cursing about the wasted time. But the tone of frustration held an undercurrent of violence, a promise of more to come. The men exited through the back door, their footsteps receding into the night, and silence returned. Luke took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now." Thomas nodded, feeling the sweat on his palms as he adjusted his grip on the bag holding the metal box. They slipped out of the closet and moved swiftly through the empty hallway, exiting the building as quietly as they had entered. The alley was deserted, but every shadow felt alive with the threat of discovery. They made their way back to the car in silence, adrenaline pumping as they scanned the darkness for any sign of the men. Once they were safely inside the car, Luke locked the doors and drove away from the apartment, blending into the quiet streets of the city. Only after they'd put several blocks between them and the building did Thomas exhale, tension slowly easing from his shoulders. "What do you think is in this thing?" Thomas asked, holding up the bag. The weight of it felt heavier than ever, as though it held not just secrets, but a piece of the nightmare that had gripped Sam and Rosie's lives. Luke kept his eyes on the road. "We'll find out soon enough, but we need to get back to the cabin first. It's the only place we can open it without risking anyone else seeing us." They drove in silence, the city's lights fading behind them as they moved through the winding country roads that led back to the cabin. Thomas's mind was racing, 1,000 different scenarios playing out in his head. What could be in the box that was worth so much trouble? Was it evidence, information on these men, or maybe even something that tied them to people with power and influence? They arrived back at the cabin just before dawn. Thomas felt a pang of relief as he spotted the small, secluded structure nestled among the trees. It felt like the only safe place left in the world. He entered the cabin quietly, peeking into the small bedroom where Sam and Rosie were still asleep, their faces relaxed and peaceful for the first time in what felt like days. Luke joined him at the kitchen table, setting the bag down between them. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken fears and unanswered questions hanging heavily around them. Thomas took a deep breath and reached for the box, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was time to find out what they had risked everything for. He unlatched the box, hesitating for just a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, he found a bundle of old documents, photographs, and a single flash drive. The photographs were black and white, grainy and slightly worn, showing images of people and places Thomas didn't recognize. But one picture caught his eye, a woman with striking features, holding a newborn, smiling faintly at the camera. The woman looked remarkably like Sam and Rosie's mother. Thomas held up the photo to Luke. "This must be her. Sam and Rosie's mom." Luke studied the photo, his expression somber. "Looks like she was involved with something serious," he muttered, flipping through the other photographs and papers. These men were after her because she knew something. These people in the pictures, they must be connected to the men chasing them. They continued sifting through the contents of the box. Many of the documents were coded, containing cryptic messages, dates, and references to names Thomas had never heard before. But one document, an old letter, caught his attention. He unfolded it carefully, scanning the faded handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means they're closing in. I kept this box hidden to protect Sam and Rosie. This information is dangerous, but it's proof of what these people have done. If anything happens to me, find someone you can trust. Protect my children." The letter was signed with her name, Emily, and a small note at the bottom read, "Luke, if you're the one finding this, remember our promise." Luke's eyes darkened as he read the letter, his jaw clenched. She must have known things were going south, but she couldn't leave without making sure her kids were safe. He shook his head, anger simmering in his voice. "I promised her that I'd help if anything happened, but I didn't know how far these people would go." Thomas felt a wave of determination rise within him. Emily had risked everything to protect her children, hiding away evidence of something dark and twisted, something that powerful people wanted buried. If we can find out who these men are, we can take them down. "We can end this," he said, his voice steady. Luke nodded, pulling out his laptop and plugging in the flash drive. "If this drive has any useful information, it could blow this wide open. But we have to be careful. We're dealing with people who have resources, connections. They'll be watching every move we make." The screen flickered to life, and a folder appeared, filled with encrypted files. Luke's fingers flew over the keyboard as he began decrypting the data, accessing files that detailed a web of corruption, blackmail, and illicit deals between powerful figures. It was all there: names, locations, and a timeline of events that tied everyone together. The network was vast, encompassing politicians, business tycoons, and shadowy figures that lurked in the periphery of society, people with money and power willing to eliminate anyone who threatened their interests. Thomas stared at the screen, the enormity of the discovery sinking in. This could bring them down," he murmured. "If we get this to the right people, it could end everything." Luke's gaze was intense. "It could, but it also puts us, and the kids, at risk. If they find out we have this, they'll stop at nothing." They spent the next few hours organizing the files, making copies of the most crucial information. By the time the first rays of dawn slipped through the window, they had everything packed and ready. They'd send it anonymously to the authorities, to media contacts who would know how to expose it without revealing their identities. They'd protect Sam and Rosie by ensuring the truth saw the light of day. Later that morning, when Sam and Rosie awoke, Thomas gathered them close, his heart full of resolve. "You're safe now," he told them, his voice gentle but certain. "Your mom, she did something very brave. She protected you so you could have a life free from fear." Sam looked up at Thomas, his eyes filled with a gratitude and understanding that went beyond his years. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching Rosie close.